Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the LitRPG podcast. I am Ramon Mejia here to bring you the latest LitRPG news, reviews, and of course author interviews. This week on the podcast, we have 8 new reviews for you this week. But before we go on to those, I want to give a quick shout out to a couple folks who are supporting the podcast, who joined Patreon for the podcast. Emma Moore has been generous enough to give a $10 a month donation to the podcast, and Kyle J. Smith a $20 a month donation to the podcast. So they both get some really great reviews, including like requested author or audio commentaries on whatever movies they want to hear. Of course, shout out on the show and some other stuff there. So if you want to become a Patreon supporter and help support the podcast and keep this show free of commercials, you're really just helping to cover the cost of the show, like hosting fees, things like that. You can always go to patreon.com/Geek Minds Podcast, which is the cover title for all the podcasts we do for that particular website, which is mine, ours. But of course, to everyone else, thank you for your support as well. But special thanks, for, of course, this week to Emma Moore and again, Kyle J. Smith. Thank you, you two. Okay, the stories we'll be reviewing this week include Fragged 6. Also, the Crystalfire Keep. This is going to be the third book in the Elements of Wrath Online series. And I think it's supposed to be like the end of that first arc. I'm not sure if the author's going to continue on the series, but if it doesn't, it's a good ending. Then also the Red Plague, which is the last book in the Last Warrior of Unigaea series. Again, I'm probably saying it wrong, but it's the last book. Also reviewing The Teenage Kings, a Western LitRPG novella. Also, One Life. This one actually is going to be out on December the 22nd, which is the release date for when most people watch this particular episode of the podcast. I'll also be reviewing Dark Infinity Online, Hunter's Bounty, a LitRPG sci-fi adventure, Dio, Book 1, long title. I'll also be reviewing World of Karik, the First Player, a LitRPG series. This is a newly translated work from Russia. So there you go. And last but not least, to be Bitter, Book 1. So there you go. But of course, we begin our show though with LitRPG news. And of course, we begin the show though with we actually have one story this week. It's a pretty slow news week for the LitRPG community. Vasily Mahenko, author of the Way of the Shaman series, has released cover art for the last novel in the Way of the Shaman series, The Clan Wars. It's supposed to be out in February of 2018. There's no specific date at this point. There is also not a pre-order available. This is just what the author is saying. The author also hopes that we enjoy all the surprises he has in store for them in this novel. The author is well known for doing last-minute twists and turns, but he did his best to tie up all the loose ends in the story. All the quests, all the whatever threads there are. He said he really did do his best to try to snap all those off so that this is a full conclusion to this particular series. The author was also nice enough to share a link that gives the first 2 chapters in English to this particular book. It is in the show notes. If you want to go check that out, it goes to something called Yadik disc, which I believe is the Russian Dropbox. So again, it's a free link. So go there where you can go check out the first 2 chapters in The Way of Shaman, book number 7. Okay, that's it for LitRPG news. There are a couple other stories that came out this week that I just didn't get a chance to read yet, but they are out, including Depths of Camlin, a LitRPG adventure in the Camlin Realm Book 2 series. Also, Know Thy Enemy by Don Chapman and Matt Faraz. That is also just came out as of, I believe, this today. So they're both out. Go check them out. I'll be reviewing them next week. There are a couple new LitRPG audiobooks as well that have come out. Survive Week 1, Codename Freedom, Book 1, written by Apollo Sloan. It is narrated by Marcelo Andrews. So there you go. We have, of course, a link to the ebook review of that particular novel, but it was a good story. Really enjoyable. I read it as an online series. Loved it as a polished, fully published version on Amazon. And I only hope that the audiobook version is as amazing. Also out is Continual Online Part 3, Realities, written by Stephen Morse, and narrated by Pavi, I can't say the last name, Prokeskilo. There's like a Z and a K and a C all in there. I know Continue Online. Stephen Morse is a friend of the podcast. We did several interviews with him. Book 3, the main character goes into like, there's a shift in the story from the fantasy world to like a robotic cyber world. So it's actually a nice change of pace for the series, and it's out as an audiobook now. So definitely recommend it. An upcoming LitRPG, this just where let you know the stuff that's coming out, as far as I'm aware, stuff for pre-orders ammo, and just stuff that the authors in the world have let us know about, including December 26th, coming Camelot Defiant, which is the 4th book in the Camelot LitRPG series. On sometime in December, we're still hoping, is going to be the Dungeon Burden Slam Dungeon Chronicles Book 4. Also, crossing my fingers for a December release for The Land of the Predators, Chaos Seed Book 7, rather. But these are more firm dates from the authors. January the 5th, 2018, press start. On January the 7th, it'll be Sigil Online, the second book in that series, Hellions, by Jeff Sproul. On January the 17th, it'll be Trap for the Potentate, Dark Herbalist Book 3. On January the 24th, it'll be The Reapers, the Nero Book number 3. And this one is new to the list. It'll be Aquila's Reign. It's titled Patera Online Book 4, but it's supposed to be a new main character and kind of a new world and series for the author. It's written by Dawn Chapman, and she's been working on an actual RPG system with another person, Chris Mayer. He's giving credit on book cover art. It is out on March the 16th. So we're hoping that this one's going to be super good. So there you go. That's the stuff that I'm aware of. That also is up for pre-order as well. So go check all those out. Pre-order the ones that you're interested in. Okay, on to new releases and reviews. Okay, on to new releases and reviews, and of course we begin with Fragged 6, written by Zachariah Dracolius. This one is 49 pages. It is 99 cents. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. This is a short story series that is it feels like it's losing its way to me, but we'll get into that in a second. The author's description of the story. The Matois are closing in. Zoe's clan is growing, and it looks like the fighters' luck is about to change. Following the events in issue 5, which saw Zoe and her clan deciding it was time to take the fight to the Matois, the budding group is starting to have internal trust issues. Not that matters to Zoe, who's recently decided that life just isn't that bad, but at the same time is struggling to stay out of her head. In the sixth issue of Fragged, Zoe and her friends start to push back against seemingly unstoppable Matois, while at the same time narrowly avoiding encounters with massive dinosaurs and struggling to keep each other alive. Okay, long and short of it, not LitRPG this time. And this has kind of been an ongoing issue with this particular series. It says it's a little bit short story, but at the same time, on the inside cover, it describes itself as something else. I'm like, okay. Again, there are literally 2 sentences in this entire story that have anything to do with like any kind of RPG progress. One has to do with crafting. One has to do with a single skill progression. Everything else is action and snark, which is not bad or anything. It's just not particularly LitRPG. And that's what I'm interested in reading in the stories that title themselves as LitRPG stories. And again, the last few episodes and some of the other ones have kind of dropped in and out of being LitRPG. But for me, it's like this series has kind of dropped the town building mechanics and the RPG mechanics that I kind of really liked at the beginning. So for me, the series is kind of going on the way. I'm probably not going to review anymore because they seem like they're stopped being LitRPG. And it kind of feels when you're reading these stories the last few times that the author is just kind of wants to write a video game story and not necessarily LitRPG, which is fine. That's just a story choice, but it's, again, not particularly interesting to me. So this particular novel gets a score of 4 out of 10. And again, I'll let you guys know when the new one comes out, but I'm not going to be reviewing them anymore. So there you go. Okay, on to another one. Book 3 in the Elements of Wrath Online series, Crystalfire Keep by J.B. Gardner and J.A. Cipriano. This one is 544 pages for $4.99. It is currently available on Kindle Unlimited. Okay, this again is the last book in this particular story arc. I don't know if it's going to be the last book in the series, but if it is, it ties things up pretty nicely. The author's description. With the opening of Crystalfire Keep Max, Kayla, and the rest of the crew find themselves in a race against time to gather a force strong enough to beat the timed raid dungeon in time to secure the big cash prize. With rival guilds causing trouble within the game and a dangerous wager in the real world looming, what begins as a difficult trial turns into a near impossible mission with consequences far outreaching a simple contest. The future of not only Max and Kayla, but that of their friends, family, and possibly the whole game are at stake. Worse, their only hope to save the day may just lie with the mysterious return of a lost legend. So there you go. Again, this is a rather satisfying conclusion to the story arc. This particular story is essentially an underdog story. A group of misfits that don't play the game like everyone else get their chance at the big prize if they can be the fastest tie in beating this new raid content. They're going up against better funded and larger guilds. For the main character and some of his group, there's also some very real world consequences if they lose. And just as a quick reminder, this totally threw me off when I was reading. In the story, there are words that are bolded and they seem like they don't make sense because they don't like fit the context of the rest of the sentence. And it took me a little while to remember that in this story, in this game world, the game world filters curse words and personal information, and they're replaced with these bolded, inserted, randomized words. I really totally forgot. It's super funny to me. I actually thought I got like a bad copy of the book. I'm like, did I just get a wrong, like bad version of the story? What's up with these bolded words? And it just took me a while to remember. So just, if you read it, remember that going in, because it eventually reminds you in the story, but it doesn't happen for like quite a bit. Overall, again, good ending to the story arc. MMO action is great. The customization through gems. There's the continued romance aspect of the story between, and I'm romance mean like just flirting, dating kind of stuff, no sex. And I guess the added consequences for the real life stuff was done rather well as well. And again, but though everything, just about everything by the end of the novel is resolved. Like I said, it's a good finality ending. There's no cliffhanger or anything. So nice stuff. Gets a score of 7 out of 10 for me. So there you go. That's going to be Crystalfire Keep, the LitRPG Saga, Elements of Wrath, Book 3, with the score of 7 out of 10. Okay, on to our next review, The Red Plague, The Last Swear of Unigaea, Book number 3 by Ramon Cooper. Okay, this one is 243 pages, $3.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. This is the third and final installment in the Last Swear of Unigaea trilogy, at least according to the author's description. And that is technically true, but it's not the end of these characters' story. So you don't have to worry about like everybody murdered or anything like that. The author's description continues. Following his massive personal loss in the second book, Auric Rune reaches the city of Tale to join Lothar and Sam Raid. Battered and bruised, but not ready to give up on his quest to save Unigaea, Auric and the company set off for Travergan to address the Red Plague. With a newfound mission, and time running out as the Red Plague continues to spread, the moment for Auric to make his mark on Unigaea is now. But will he be able to? And is it even possible? Tight, brutal, and incredibly intense. Oh, that's just the end. So, there we go. Like I said, my review is basically... it's again not the actual end of the story, and if you've been reading along with the in this particular universe, you'll know that these characters show up in other books later. So this could, of course, couldn't be like the end. It's just the end in this particular world. So don't worry about that. It's a nice conclusion though for this particular story arc. There's a bit of magic wand waving in the first 20% of the novel that was kind of annoying with. The sacrifice that Wolf made at the end of book 2 is completely erased, and that really annoyed me because it felt like there was actual consequence to something that happened in this story for once. And it is some, and it's like, but when it's just magically reversed, I'm like, oh, that just takes away the gravity of that particular move. But again, author's choice, he kind of had to bring him back somewhere because he shows up in those other books later on, like as like temporal cross stories, I guess. So I don't know why he did it, but it's like it still was a little annoying. But that's me. On the writer's side of the story, of course, the story has the same great action and humor you've come to enjoy about the series. It also includes an introduction to the larger Proxima multiverse, which Ramon Cooper has essentially with all of his series. They're on the same like Proxima universe. In this particular case, there's some world jumping. So there's also spaceships and ways to travel to other games, and all that's included in the story. So a lot of interesting good stuff. Again, a good ending to this particular trilogy. Gets a score of 7 out of 10. So there you go. Okay, that's right. The Red Plague of the Last War of Unigaea, Book 3, score a 7 out of 10. Someone asked me to remember to read the book title at the end with the review score, because sometimes when they're just listening to it, they get lost. So there you go. Okay, here we go. The Teenage Kings is our next review. They call this a Western LitRPG novella. It's 79 pages. It is 99 cents. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. I think it's 79 pages. It's just a short story, but I could be mistaken. I'm not super into those technicalities. But I'll read you the author's description. It's written by, of course, Casper Vega. Here's the author's description. Being a successful independent rapper isn't what Dick Dashing thought it would be. The pressure to deliver fresh material combined with unexpected personality changes are making him question his choices and doubt his future in the industry. When something related to Dick's forgotten hometown is mentioned in an unexpected way, it sets off a journey that will make him question his own reality. That's it. That's all the author says. Nothing about game stuff. And there's really not much in the story about game stuff at all. The author also, oddly enough, mentions in his blurb that the story is going to be more expensive after the 25th of December for some reason, for 79 cents. That seems a little weird, but again, author's choices. Quick review. This isn't LitRPG, not in any way, shape, or form. There's a few game mechanics mentioned about the 67% mark, but even then it's like a super minor point of the story. No RPG mechanics whatsoever. And that's it. Not LitRPG. Not gonna get a good review. The story itself is not particularly entertaining either. So there you go. Get the score of 4 out of 10 for Teenage Kings, a Western LitRPG novella, because it's not actually LitRPG. So there you go. Okay, on to our next story. One Life, written by Luke Green. This is 187 pages, $3.80, which is a little expensive. Also, it is not available on Kindle Unlimited. So there you go. This novel is actually going to be available on December the 22nd, which is when most people are going to be actually watching this particular podcast. So it'll be available once that date hits. I'll read you the author's description. One Life is a massively multiplayer online game where players can escape the reality of the classist wasteland that is the real world and enter a realm filled with fantasy and adventure. However, when a terrorist organization called the Shadow Prophets realize that they can manipulate the game to help fund their own dark ventures, they try to take control. Now a special quest has been activated, and Lucas finds himself thrust into situations that are way over his head, both in the real and digital worlds. Strap in for a race against time as Lucas and the party must uncover the secrets of One Life before the game falls entirely into the wrong hands. Okay, that's the author's description. Full disclosure, the author sent me an advance copy of the novel for review. Basically, the author sent me an email, or the podcast rather, requesting a review of his novel. He said, it's absolute RPG. Please review it. It'll be available on the 22nd. He sent me an advance copy, and that's what this is. And I read it, and I basically found it a little. I'll say that it is lit RPG technically, but the game mechanics are really. And the author was totally upfront about it. He's like, the game mechanics are light. I'm pushing this towards a younger audience. YA kind of novel. So he was upfront that was going to be the case. And I'll get into that. Okay. The first 15% of the novel is kind of a muddled mix of world building, explanation of what the game One Life is, and a bit of backstory of the main character, Lucas. In this particular world, the world portion, the world is kind of an unemployed mess. Robots have taken over. Not everybody can get a job. The main character is just old enough to decide whether or not he wants to live in the digital world or in the real world. And he chooses, of course, the digital world. One Life is an MMO game that has kind of taken over the world and given people the opportunity to turn their in-game money into real world money. I mean, they're never going to be rich for the most part, but most people kind of manage to get by essentially farming gold and items in this game, and then converting that into real world currency and using that to buy like the basic necessities of food and drink and clothes and stuff. Now the game itself is described initially as a permadeath fantasy survival game with zombies. And according to like the beginning intro section, most people stay in the starter noob zone, because it's player versus environment only. Like most people never venture out of their starter zones because once they get into player versus player, people don't survive. And that's kind of how it's described in the beginning of the story, which vastly changes later on. The main character makes his living selling starter gear and also being a game guide. And that's kind of the end of the like beginning description of the story, like the introduction portion. When the actual story begins, the main character ends up following another player that insulted him and intends to PK her or player kill her once she's outside of town. Only he inadvertently becomes involved in this really big quest to save the game from an evil group of bad guys. And that's kind of my description of the story. The story itself is only okay. I believe this is the author's first novel, so that kind of makes sense that he's trying to find his way about like things to include in the story to make it interesting and engaging. But unfortunately, it kind of doesn't pick up a lot of interest, and I'll explain this in a second, but to me, it kind of suffers from an over-influence of Ready Player One. When I was reading this story, I definitely got the vibe of like, oh, this is someone read Ready Player One, they really loved it, and they wanted to write something similar because they had such a good time. Like you could tell basically that the author loved that story, and then he's pulling a lot of like things he enjoyed about it into this particular story because that's what this is my guess part, that's what he thinks LitRPG maybe and a story with like video games should be like. And while being as interesting as Ready Player One is a great goal, I think the author pulls in a little too much influence, and that makes his novel feel a little less original. He's definitely copying everything from Ready Player. He's not. This is original story, the original characters, the original references, of course. But you definitely get a lot of the same vibes. The basic gist of the story is that the main character and his group follow a set of clues to find and protect the one object that will give control of the game to them, or who controls it. They're opposed by a shadowy organization with a seemingly limitless resources that sends out identical agents to capture or kill them in game and out. There are also a ton of pop culture references from the 80s and 90s, like a lot. And like I said, that's super similar to Ready Player One, which is, if that's what you're looking for, great. But for me, I was always comparing this particular story to Ready Player One, and this one came up wanting. So I was like, that's all that. And to me, it wasn't a great thing. Like it was entertaining in itself, but again, that comparison to Ready Player One did not do this particular story any favors. Okay. And again, with the references like the 80s and 90s stuff, in this story, they don't really make sense because again, this story is set in the very far future. And as is Ready Player One, only in Ready Player One, the references are contextually, they make sense. There's a shared cultural appreciation for 80 references and culture because the guy who made Ready Player One, the game, the Oasis, grew up in that time frame, and he based all the clues to the contest around 80s trivia and culture. And so people who wanted to win that contest fully immersed themselves in that culture, and so it became part of a modern culture again. In this story, that premise doesn't exist, and so instead, the reader is basically assumed to believe that a bunch of 20-year-olds from the very far future understand 80s and 90s pop culture references, and not just like pop culture, but like tech references too. Like at some point in the story, they want a secure way to talk to each other, and so they decide to use DOS, a DOS chat program. And everybody apparently has like, hey, you familiar with the DOS chat program? And everyone's like, in the group is like, yeah, of course. Like, oh yeah, 20-year-olds know about DOS in the future, which means that they're like barely being born now. And also dial-up modems and other various movie references, which are, again, like I said, they make sense in the context of if the story was set now, maybe. Like there are plenty of 20-year-olds who were like born, who are around now, who wouldn't get these references. So it just contextually in the story doesn't make sense that they would on their own in the far future. And again, the premise for them to do so just what doesn't exist in the story the same way it did in Ready Player One. Let's see. There are of course some gaming issues and some story issues. Like in one instance, the main character again is chasing a high level player because she insulted him. And the way he kind of gets into this whole situation is that he sees her fighting a high level monster in the player versus player zone. And she's about to get killed. And so he jumps in and saves her, except he just cuts a high level monster with his knife, not doing any damage. But yet he's rewarded with once she kills the monster with half the experience points, and he gets the magic quest everyone's looking for because he hurt the monster, or he attacked the monster but didn't do damage. Like little things like that just don't make sense. I mean, I understand they're necessary to move the story forward in the way that the author wants to. It's just that the game logic doesn't exist, and that's kind of something that recurs again and again in the story. There are plenty of other pet peeves for me, but again, some of the game stuff is probably the biggest stuff, because even though there are levels in the story, they become less and less relevant. Like the main character, just from that one beginning fight, goes from level I believe it's 5 to 10, and then to 12, like a little bit later. And then after that, even though the story says that he levels or references other characters and in the fight that they're higher or lower level them, you stop seeing numbers, which is kind of weird to me because it seems like it wouldn't be that hard to manage. But again, that's me as a person, as a writer. I understand that not everybody really cares about those numbers as much. And I think that's kind of what the case is here, is that the author, while he's interested in that game story, he's not as interested in like the game details or keeping track of things like experience points or level numbers, or really kind of setting up any of those kind of game system. Is more like, oh, these are the games that I love. These are the references I love. I'm going to make a story about it. And for the most part, that he does a successful job of doing that. It's just that there were just things in the story that bothered me, and they're, maybe you can call them pet peeves, but they definitely lowered my enjoyment of the story. For example, this novel uses a lot of pop culture references, but it doesn't always use them correctly, or to me, it doesn't do them justice. For example, there's one point in the story where there's a Doctor Who reference. One of the characters flips a coin and she gets a TARDIS, except that in the story, Doctor Who is spelled DR space WHO instead of as Doctor Who, DOCTOR space WHO, and TARDIS is spelled incorrectly. It's spelled capital T, lowercase everything else, when it's actually all capitals, because it's an acronym for time and relative dimension in space, whatever it is, right? Which means it needs to be all capitalized. And these are just like small details that you realize, oh, this person probably isn't really a Doctor Who fan, but they included it because a lot of readers probably are. And there's like a lot of things like that, a lot of small details that show that there's a lack of appreciation for these fandoms, because it would have taken like, I don't know, a 2-second Google search to figure out the right spelling of these things. But that effort wasn't put into it. And that kind of shows with a lot of the other pop culture references as well, and some of the game references. Another small pet peeve of me, for me again, is that there's a fundamental flaw in the game premise of the story. The big threat to the game, this is a little spoilery, but it's not like a big deal because it happens fairly early in the story. If the bad guys get this particular magic item that's supposed to help them control the game world, what they're actually getting is all the user data for the players in the world, including their IP address. And it's heavily emphasized that if the bad guys get their IP addresses, they're going to know all the information about those players, including their actual addresses, and they're going to be able to transfer out funds from their accounts and take over the game somehow. That's not explained ever. And for me, it's just exceptionally irritating, because an IP address is not the same as a physical address. Like for a lot of people, they're correlatory, of course, but the reality is that IP addresses can be changed, and they can be different, and they can be spoofed. And there are plenty of programs like VPN programs that will allow people to show whatever IP address they want to from other countries, or from other, states or whatever. And there's also this kind of supposition that this somehow gives them control of things. It would be tantamount to saying that if someone finds your home address, they magically have access to your bank account and control the city you live in, because they have that information. And it just doesn't make sense to me, which means that most of the story, the stakes of the story also don't make sense to me. And that was just kind of banana. There are some other pet peeves, of course. One of the bigger ones, of course, is that it's the main character actually plays the game on a mouse and keyboard, which is a little weird because, again, in the far future, apparently this is not a VR game. It's not a console. He's just playing it on a regular PC, but it's written from the perspective of like, oh, he's in the game doing stuff. So I'm like, okay, that's also the threats that are made, like being forced to be logged into the story. They don't really feel like threats if you can just like stand up and walk away from his computer. It's not like he's stuck in VR, regular VR pod, and then it's stuck there. And again, like I said, the game mechanics are just kind of disappointing because of their lack of detail. which I've already mentioned a bit. But again, after the 20% mark, they appear occasionally to remind you you're in a game, but there is a severe lack of detail. And like I said, all these things together just kind of lessened my enjoyment of an already kind of not amazing story. The story by itself will probably get like a 6 out of 10, but because of these other things, these other issues, especially the game mechanic stuff, it dropped my enjoyment level a little extra bit. But again, I don't want to give you the impression that there's nothing good about the story. There are some great things. The action is very decently written. There's a great variety of settings and monsters and fights that the characters go through. There's a legitimate attempt to pull ideas from a variety of like games that the author seems to love, including like stealth mechanics, survival games, RPGs, and some action stuff. Again, they don't really work very well for me because of a lack of detail, but it's a really good attempt. Also, some of the characters are really interesting and funny, and like, you know, you're gonna like them. And there is kind of a sub-thread of like explaining the dangers to society depending on a video game for economic growth, which I thought was kind of cool. But again, overall, you know, the combination like some kind of a lackluster story plus those other issues, like, and the comparison to Ready Player One constantly, I'm like, this is kind of a mess story for me, unfortunately. And then just a lot of the negatives kind of overshadowed the positives, at least for me. So for me, it gets a score of 5 out of 10. That's one life. With a score of 5 out of 10. So there you go, unfortunately. Okay, on to our next review. It is going to be Dark Infinity Online, Hunter's Bounty, a LitRPG sci-fi adventure. D.O. Book 1. It is written by Takeshi Mori. Okay, this one is 244 pages. It is $3.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. Man, this hat is making me so warm. Whew. Okay. Here is the author's description. Worley's days as a bounty hunter are numbered. Ever since the government put those darn police robots on the streets, criminality has seen a huge drop, and he's now struggling to even find a shoplifter to apprehend. With rent to pay, no money in the bank, and a serious drinking problem to fund, the situation is getting desperate for him. But where is a man with his particular skills supposed to turn to? Chasing criminals is all he knows, and it's all he's ever done. That's when Worley will learn about Dark Infinity Online, a game where criminality still runs rampant and money, real money, can be made for those with enough guts to join in. With nothing to lose, Worley spends his last credits buying the game. But in a world without laws and rules, the line blurs between good and evil, and there's nothing more telling which side is which. Torn between two rival factions fighting for control of the server, will Worley make the right choice? So there we go. Again, 244 pages, $3.99, and available on Kindle Unlimited. Okay, this story is set in the far-flung future where robots have taken over many jobs and cities have become multi-levered behemoths. So it's set in the far future. The author does a really good job of describing like the actual world and giving you a vibe of like, oh, this is the future. Like I said, and the author also does a really good job of describing like the game's setting, which is a space-going civilization between like space stations and spaceships going all over the place. And it's supposed to be a VR game. Like I said, the author does a really good job, like the world-building portions of the story. And the sci-fi elements of this novel are definitely a strong suit. Where it lacks, unfortunately, is in the game mechanics and a logical storyline that connects the game and the real world. And I'll get into details in a second. Okay, first the good. The first 8% of this novel is nice. It really is good. The author again describes a world that is bursting with sci-fi character. The main character has flaws galore and to work on, and empathy for a situation is quickly established. The author also gets the main character in the game world fairly quickly, which is always a plus for me. By the 4% mark, he's in the game, and it's as described in the author description. Although the description of the interface is a little dated, which I'll get to again, the author does a really good job of attempting to describe the noob experience of playing an MMO. There are issues with learning how to manage the keyboard control scheme, how to control the game camera, what to do in the world, and how not to die very much. So all those things are really well done, and that's all that happens in the first 8% of the novel. However, after the 12% mark, when the main character gains his first level, which, you know, as a side note, doesn't seem to mean anything, the game stuff kind of switches to something more that feels like normal sci-fi. And as the story continues on, you're going to get less game stuff and more just like descriptive sci-fi material. And that beginning charm of like, oh, this being a fully fleshed out game world where there's experiences from these game mechanics, they kind of disappear. And that is kind of unfortunate for me. Again, this is technically a LitRPG novel. Throughout the story, the main character, Warley, or the game name XU, completes missions for experience which gain him levels. However, there are no experience points shown. So it's just like, oh, he completes a mission, and he checks out, oh, I'm level whatever. And again, for most of the novel, those levels don't really mean anything. Like, until like almost a third in the story, the main character doesn't even realize that he can open a character sheet. It's just literally like, oh, I'm level something, and he continues on in the story. And as more time in the story goes on, I basically realized that there's a severe lack of description of like how this VR MMO game works. So much so that as I was reading, there's a particular point in the story where the main character gets a new spaceship, and the ship's AI describes to him how he has to function in the ship, how he can fly it, and it goes into like some pretty detail, like, oh, this particular switch does this, you must do these things in this particular order, you can control it this way, and different control schemes, and how he has to use the toggle switch to fly the whole thing, and it gets really detailed. And I realized that this description of the spaceship is actually longer than the game and the description of the game mechanics in the story. And that kind of reveals to me in like a nice little synopsis how the author feels about the story and like game mechanics versus the sci-fi stuff. And that he does a really good job about the sci-fi stuff, but the game mechanics don't really matter as much, at least in this particular story. They're there, they exist, and they're relatively consistent, except that there's little to no detail. And that is kind of the biggest drawback for me. Additionally, there are other issues with the story in the fact that the way the main character interacts with the game world is kind of unusual and honestly contradictory when you actually read and compare. In the game world is described again as a space survival MMO, virtual reality MMO. Yet, if this is a virtual reality game, why is it the main character uses a standard computer screen and a mouse and a keyboard to play the game? Like, the author really goes out of his way to emphasize, oh, he's using a mouse and keyboard and a monitor. Even going so far as to describe, oh, the WASD control scheme and having to use the mouse to shift perspective. He's like, the main character actually says, I would rather use the mouse and keyboard than some stupid VR rig. So it's not like the virtual reality rigs don't exist. It's an intentional choice to play a virtual reality MMO with a mouse and keyboard. I mean, later on it makes sense as far as like the story choice. It's just that there's a disconnect between what's described in the beginning using the keyboard and mouse and that setup, and what's described as the actual game content. It's emphasized again throughout the beginning of the story that this is the keyboard stuff. But the story describes the main character as if he's there in the story. As if he's moving around, as if he's interacting with his hands and feet, and he's feeling things like he feels heat and cold and sadness and anger and a bunch of emotions in the story, as if he's in that game world interacting with these AI, characters or the NPCs or these other players or whatever. Or he's fighting and he feels the adrenaline rush as he grabs the joystick and twists and turns and zooms through space, etc. Right? Except that in the back of my mind, every time I see these really nicely written descriptive moments and these emotive moments, in the back of my mind, it's always like, oh, he's literally just sitting in front of a keyboard and a screen. So these emotions aren't accurate. And it comes up later in the story. Like sometimes when there's like a particularly exciting experience, it's really broken up when the author says, oh, and then the main character sits back in his chair and drinks a beer while looking at his computer screen. I'm like, brain confused. And that's probably one of the bigger issues for me, at least. Okay. I also give in the written version of this review, I give a nice little description of like a particular section that kind of describes what I'm talking about. I'll read it off to you folks. Actually, I'll pull it up so you can see it as well. Again, this is an excerpt from the story. His heart thumped in his chest. His palms grew sweaty and his hands pushed forward on the wheel hard. His eyes remained fixed on the threat giant ship, almost like a monster from the dreams of a child. His mind frozen in its flight of terror. This is what it felt like to be prey. He had never felt small and powerless before. But again, this is a nice emotive scene. It's well written. However, it just has a lack of impact because like 2 seconds later, it's like, oh, the main character is tapping on his keyboard. And so like those emotive qualities shouldn't exist if unless like the main character was in a VR rig and he was actually in that world. But again, the story is told from the perspective of somebody who's sitting at a mouse and keyboard, looking at a computer screen. And it kind of took me a little while to kind of guess what the issue was for me. And again, this is totally hypothetical. I'm kind of guessing that let's see, number 6. I'm basically guessing that the author initially wrote the story as a sci-fi space adventure, which is cool. And then later adapted it to something like LitRPG. It's also possible that he wrote a lot of the scenes as just straight sci-fi and later just wrote the LitRPG stuff like later and added it in. But either way, that kind of makes more sense to me because a lot of this is told from the perspective of somebody who's actually there. And with the game mechanics that the way it is, it just doesn't make sense. Also, story-wise, there were just some oddities that just, let's see. Yeah, and also it kind of makes sense why the story is so much more of an emphasis on the space sci-fi stuff than on the game arcs, because they were likely added in later. Okay, there are a couple other oddities in the story. The story tension in the real world relies on the fact that players can cash out game credits for real world money, which is great. That happens now. But the oddity occurs for me, at least in the story-wise, when people are getting arrested in the real world for doing bad things in the game, like stealing. Just because those credits could possibly turn into real money. That to me doesn't make sense. That's like saying that your thief character in WoW can, because he's a thief and he can steal money from NPC characters or whatever, the person who's playing that character can be arrested in the real world just because that game money can be cashed out at some point in the future for like traded for real money. And to me, that just doesn't make any kind of logical sense, but it's used in the story as like a fundamental concept, like, oh, this is the threat to the main character in the real world, so he has to be careful, or he has to be concerned about it at least. And a lot of the story is kind of based upon that foundational premise, which again kind of makes it a little shaky, at least for me. Overall, as a sci-fi story, this would be a relatively decent read. It would get a 6 out of 10 for me. But there are some plot holes in here. But the action and intrigue in the game between the two factions kind of makes up for it. But as LitRPG, which is what this story says it is, and it was what I'm judging it on, it was kind of disappointing. There's really no depth to any of the game stuff. And again, it is LitRPG, technically, but it wasn't particularly enjoyed because I'm not getting a lot of the stuff that I really love, which is information about the game world, the game mechanics. And that is what it is. It's just, not particularly great for me. And again, while it's disappointing, if it is as I guess it is, which is that this is an adapted sci-fi story, it kind of makes sense. Again, there are better LitRPG sci-fi stories out there if you want to read them. The game, which is spelled GAM3, World Seed, Futuristic Dungeon Core, Continue Online, Phantom Server, Office Wars. There's a lot more out there that are better sci-fi LitRPG stories that actually have information about the sci-fi game mechanic world. They are better to me, at least. For me, this particular story gets a score of 5 out of 10. It became very meh after like the first 12% of the story. That's Dark Infinity Online, Hunter's Bounty, a LitRPG sci-fi adventure, DO Book 1. It gets a score of, again, a 5 out of 10. Kind of meh. Okay, on to our next story. Here we go. World of Karik, the first player LitRPG series written by A. Emelianov and S. Savanov. Okay, this one was a request from somebody mentioned online, and they're like, hey, I said I review it. It's a really long book, but honestly, it's kind of nice. I liked it, but there are issues. It is 681 pages. That's massive. It is $2.98. It is also available on Kindle Unlimited, so that's nice. I'll read you the author's description. You can kind of get a vibe for how it reads. Okay. Welcome to the new world. People around you were killed, but you and a group of strangers could get to this dangerous place by the will of mysterious creatures. That's what it says, folks. Imagine a community of liars and scoundrels who were able to survive by killing their friends and fellows. Those people surround you. Everyone is lying, trying to get an advantage. Everyone has a secret. The world of Karik is similar to the game. You can get levels, increase your stats, and even rise from the dead in case of failure. However, if you do make a mistake, if you do believe the wrong person, you will die forever. Everyone knows where is the way out of this world. It seems that you can return home, but not a single person did ever come back. Did you want to be the first? Then you have to decide who is standing next to you, the friend or the foe, the creature of the abyss or an innocent victim. The description of the note says the translation has been faithfully made by a non-profit agency, Cowabunga. So there you go. This is a Russian translation. There are very big issues, and I put a warning in the review section that there's some serious issues in translation. Remember, it's translated from Russian to English by a set of volunteers who are not professional translators. So if that kind of stuff hurts your brain, don't read this because it's throughout the entire novel. I included like a little section from the actual book in the review, like the written review portion. I'll read it off to you. It says, there you go. Oops, there you go. It's great, Olga said. As I thought, a little disappointed. I think we have come. The path led us to a clearing surrounded by a rock on one side. On the left, there was a small brook. On the right, a forest. We came, Andrea announced. And that's what it actually says. But in the context of the actual story, what it basically means is like they're arriving at a particular camp in the story. But they describe it as, oh, have we came? Have we come? And like, that isn't quite right. It makes me giggle because of other things. Because I'm like a 14-year-old kid in my sense of maturity. But the story itself is pretty decent. But the translation issues are really going to bug the heck out of some people. So if you're one of those people, just don't read this. It's really going to bother you. But at $2.98, it's a really good price, especially for the amount of content. But it's also on Kindle Unlimited. So if you just want to try it out in KU to see if you like it or download a sample, I would highly recommend that. To me, the novel is best described as an apocalypse survival slice of life LitRPG. There are similar stories in the world out there. So stories like The Arcane Survivalist, Life in the North, Gamer the Dead, and Survival World, they're all very similar in that they emphasize that everything's changed. Like some weird event has occurred or people have been transported to some game world. And the emphasis is on survival, but also doing it with RPG mechanics. And that's what this basically is. There is no world plot. It really is just the main character trying to survive, meeting a group of people, figuring out social dynamics, the rules of the world, the game rules of the world, and also the social rules of the world, which are different because all these people are essentially, I'm not going to spoil it for you, but they're all not necessarily good people by any stretch of the imagination. So there, in this particular story, one of the big draws, at least for me, was the fact that you don't know who to trust. Like no character that's introduced is necessarily a good person or somebody that's not going to betray you later on. And so there's always like that's tension of like, oh, who's going to do evil things? Or is the main character going to be the bad person and betray everybody? We don't know. Some of the game mechanics of the story, which are revealed very early on, and also mentioned in the author description, is that people are being taken from Earth by powerful beings and dropped onto another planet or dimension. This planet has RPG rules. Each person is given one skill or ability to help them survive, and given a tombstone that they will resurrect at if they die. However, if that tombstone is broken, they will die permanently. So there's the tension and the trade-off of the stakes of the game. The main character convinces the god of chaos to give him mastery of magic, and thus he starts off with a rather overpowered ability among all the other players of the world. And while there's a way to exit the world, it's so difficult, nobody has yet succeeded. And again, the story is basically a slice of life power-up story. It just gives you a description of all the events that the character goes through as he lives in this world. Again, there's no huge plot. It's more about the main character learning about the rules of the world, leveling up, betrayals that force him to power up more, and repeating it all again and again. There's enough variety of monsters to fight, plot twist betrayals, and ways to power up that the story is interesting, even being like over 600 pages long. However, the two biggest drawbacks of the story are going to be the translation issues and the sheer length of the story, which makes some parts of the story really do feel like filler. And honestly, you can actually skip over them and not lose anything. If a section of the story just feels like, oh, this doesn't make sense, feel free to skip it. You're going to continue on in the adventure leveling up portions of the story. They didn't ruin it for me. I actually enjoyed the story quite a bit. It was nice. But I know that they're going to bug other people, which is why the story doesn't get a 7 out of 10 for me. I'm basically taking a point for translation issues and a bit of filler because again, it's going to bug people. And it kind of drops the enjoyment level for a lot of people. So for me, however, it gets a score of 6 out of 10. World of Karik, the first player, LitRPG series, gets a score of 6 out of 10. So there you go. Okay, next one. Okay, last but not least, this is another one. Bitter, Book 1 by V. Moody. It is 296 pages, $3.99. It is not available on Kindle Unlimited, so it can be kind of an investment. It is, again, written by V. Moody. The author's description is really short. VR MMO RPG has arrived, along with bugs, exploits, OP classes, and an over-the-top nerfs. P2W, ridiculous RNGs, random number generators, lockboxes, raging players, broken mechanics, limited backspace, tedious crafting, and then there are the goblins and ogres. Bitter is the story of a girl who finds her life isn't what she wanted, so she gets another one. So there you go. This is from the author of How to Avoid Death on a Daily Basis, which is rather nice portal fiction series. It's almost LitRPG, but it's not, unfortunately. But it is a nice portal fiction story, and I actually enjoy the series quite a bit. This one is by the same author, and you kind of get a very similar vibe. This is a published version of the online serial of the same name. Book 1 has the first 100 chapters. Book 2, which is also out, continues the story. Now, first question is this LitRPG? Yes, absolutely. There's plenty of RPG progression, though the game system isn't like anything amazing to write home about. It is detailed throughout the story. There's plenty of numbers and levels and skill trees and magic progression and all that good stuff. The story probably, in my opinion, spends too much time in the world, but the main character is a teenager. She's a high school kid, so it makes sense that she can't play 24/7 like, I would necessarily. This is mostly like a slice of life story again. Just like that last story I talked about, slice of life is basically you're just following the person as they do their daily things. It's a slice of their life. And that's what the story is for the most part. In this case, so the main character is a teenage girl who's a huge complainer. And that's one of the things that bugs me. She gets access to her dad's new VR game rig. She's not supposed to use it, but she's a sneaky kid, so she jumps in when he's not there. And she only intends to take a little trip into the game world to see what's so cool about it and why her dad's spending so much time there. But in the process of a series of poor character creation choices, she finds herself with a very unique character, one that has to find new and interesting ways to fight and interact with the NPCs. And that's kind of the draw of the story for me, at least, and that the character has these unique interactions. She has to do things differently, and that is to her benefit most of the time, but also leads on to some very interesting game results, which I won't spoil. Like I said, most of the story is about the main character exploring the starting parts of the fantasy VR game, learning about the game mechanics, the magic stuff, levels, skills, stats, all that good stuff, and some of the early quests that she does. Again, what's interesting with the story is that how the teen gets around the game's standard events and bends their AI rules for some very interesting effects. That's kind of the draw for me, at least. The real life storyline is kind of boring because she's in high school and she's just kind of complaining about everything. She's complaining about her school life, her friends, her school, other students, all that good stuff. But again, it's not my thing, but I can see how it's a draw to other people who like that kind of gossipy drama stuff. Overall, it's a good story. Though it takes some time to get past the whiny, complaining main character, about the 20% mark. Once she's in the game, it gets more interesting. I had a fun time reading it. I also like slice of life stories. Some people find them to be unfocused, because again, there's not really a plot as much as just I think some would call it like a journal story. Where they're just talking about the daily events that someone goes through, and that's all this is. There's no villain, there's no like really arch villain, there's no like real like end of the world scenario the main character's trying to save him for. It's just her daily activities, and like I said, it's a slice of life story, and I like them. If you don't like those kind of stories, you might not enjoy this one as much, but for me, it was enjoyable. Again, the end of book 1 is kind of like a pause. And book 2 is available now, though, but just be aware that the ending is not really an ending as much as a pause. And they expect you to, book 2 is right down the street. Go pick it up. It's available now. So there you go. For me, though, it's enjoyable. Gets a score of 7 out of 10. That's Bitter, book 1, with a score of 7 out of 10. So there you go, folks. That is it. We're done. Finished. Finito. complete for the podcast. Thank you very much for listening and watching. If you can follow the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Patreon, we'll have a link in the show notes for you guys to follow us or listen to us or, whatever. If you enjoy the podcast in any way, other shape, or form, you can find out all the ways to support the podcast at litrpgpodcast.com/support. Thank you again, though, for hanging out with me and listening to me talk about the genre that I love, LitRPG, and being a member of the community and just interacting with me. I get emails from folks. They're always happy to read and enjoy and get your opinions. And again, thank you everyone for your support. Until we can hang out again, though, remember, folks, to go read some LitRPG. Goodbye, everybody.